As I promised, I want to talk a little bit about the basic concepts around zero-based budgeting for the public sector. I mean, the most basic thing you can take away from this is a zero-based budget starts at zero. So we're going to talk very briefly about the introduction of this type of budgeting application, why it might be useful for public safety, and then perhaps a case study or two. So when we look at zero-based budgeting, when you hear the term, you have to think about how does this differ from what your agency may or may not be doing right now. In class, we spoke about the different types of budgeting, line item budgets, program-based budgets, and project-based budgets. Line item budgets is what would be most similar to the zero-based budget. The only real difference is when you get a line item budget, typically year to year, you make adjustments for changes. So there was an increase in the cost of gas, or training expected to go up 5%, or whatever that might be. So you make these adjustments. What you don't do typically in a line item budget is you don't go back to ground zero and have to re-justify why you're asking for the ask. It's almost a given. And the thing about doing it that way is that there's generally no real hard look at what the money is being expended on, or more importantly, why is it being expended. The zero-based budget requires you to go back and re-justify each year, as you can imagine, very timely, but and time-consuming, but that's sort of the mindset behind it. So basic premise, zero-based budget requires starting from zero, as we talked. Resource allocation efficiency. Zero-based budget promotes efficiency by allocating resources based on necessary or necessity, aligning spending with organizational goals. Now think about that. There's the two things that are important here. We talked about our mission statement, and we talked about our strategic plan and our 5-year plan. So as you're putting your zero-based budget together, make sure that it aligns with the goals of the organization. And the last piece, justification of budget request. Program managers must justify each budget request, enhancing accountability and strategic financial planning. Again, go back to that 5-year plan. That is a strategic plan to allocate resources over a given period of time to meet anticipated goals or objectives. Where this would be interesting is you get into year 3 and you have resource allocation set for X, and for whatever reason, you haven't gotten to the point where you can actually deploy X. Therefore, you have to reallocate those funds. Well, the opportunity now is to reallocate those funds into another program that you can justify needs the money at that time. Couple of comparisons. Traditional budgeting relies on historical data, which can lead to continuation of outdated practices. So as I spoke of before, you may just continue doing the same thing because you've always done it that way. So you repeat the same thing. The zero-based budget encourages a very fresh look at everything every cycle. So it promotes a culture of accountability and prioritizes where those resources need to go. In our case, where those resources need to go in the creation of the Grasslands PD and to meet our strategic objectives as defined by the mission statement. Enhanced resource allocation enables organization to allocate specifically and effectively for needs that are at that time. It definitely has an increased accountability simply by the fact that you have to redo it each year and re-justify each year. Creates a much higher degree of accountability as to why the money is needed and how it's being spent. And of course, the last thing it says improves cost management. Well, of course, if you scrutinize the budget each year in fine detail, chances are you're going to find any inefficiencies or waste that you might not have found otherwise. So the application of zero-based budgeting in the public sector. Now, you can imagine that this is one of those things that could be met with a lot of resistance. I mean, you can expect that staff are going to push back on a zero-based budget if you do it on a recurring basis, because the workload required to do this far exceeds line item budget where you make adjustments on a regular basis. However, it can be particularly valuable in the public sector where resource allocation must be transparent and justifiable. And we talked in our last class about some of the unique qualities of public budgeting versus private. And one of those really big items comes down to public trust, accountability, and transparency. And zero based budgeting allows for a high degree of transparency. I think I hit on some of these already. Service prioritization. Yep. It basically has you reevaluate annually where you need to have your specific needs right now. It is very much focused on outcomes, ensuring that public services deliver tangible benefits. In other words, is the service that you're providing the service you expected to provide, and is it meeting the needs of the community for which the service is being provided? And that sounds like a lot. It's a lot to say without saying, look at, are you spending the money wisely and are you having the impact you thought it'd have? The other thing is, because we draw our funds not through profit, but through taxpayers who pay into the tax-based system, it can assure that we use efficient use of tax funds, that we can show the community that we're doing it efficiently and effectively. So a couple of quick things as you go through the process and you think about. Steps involved in implementing. First, identify the decision units. In other words, the first step of implementing the zero-based budget is to identify decision units, which are segments of the organization responsible for specific activities. Think about the exercise we did the other night, and we didn't have a lot of time, but what that was really getting down to is that you may, in operations division, you may have a core patrol function. You may have a special operations section. You may have a dedicated traffic unit. You may have a dedicated community engagement unit. There's all types of different things that come into that. Identifying those units is a critical piece of this zero-based budgeting. Now, in the development of the Grasslands PD, you're really starting with some of the basics. Your primary thing is going to get people employed on the payroll. But for that strategic plan, looking at over the next couple of years, what are the units, the identifying units that you want to expand upon, and how and when? The next step involves creating decision packages that outline the cost. And everything that you do, there's going to be an associated cost with it. As you work through the zero-based budget, I am mostly interested in what you do in high level. So when you talk about outfitting an officer, if you told me that the cost to outfit an officer with X amount of equipment is X amount of dollars, that will be fine. I don't need to know it costs $5 for a whistle and $18 for a piece of the belt and so many dollars for this piece. Think of the upper level components, but I do need to understand, and you need to be able to justify what you're putting forward and why you need it. There's a ton of things. I'll use VEST, for example. If you're going to tell me that part of the zero-based budget for deploying assets for a basic patrol unit requires the officers to have a vest, then a vest is not cheap. Per vest, $1,000. What is the underlying data that you're going to use to support that? Well, an easy one could be a study from the National Institutes of Justice that have shown that vests greatly increase the likelihood of survival in an officer ambush or an officer attack. Just think how you make the connection back to what you're asking for to research that's out there that supports what the ask is about. And I know this is challenging because for the most part, you're in a positions where you've been doing this for years and these things just appear. Somebody at the beginning of it had to be able to go out through the purchasing process and articulate why they bought that specific piece of equipment, what the cost was, and articulate why it was needed. I need you to be thinking about that as you go through the zero-based budget piece. That falls into this last part, talking about justifying expenses. Each decision must be justified based upon the merits of the program and the transparency in the budget. Challenges and solutions. Yes, there's going to be resistance to change in a zero-based budget culture. I don't think it's likely that when you go back to your own agencies, you're going to encounter this, but it's good to understand about how you get there. The complexities of understanding how to go through the budget process, we're barely touching on it in the 8 weeks we're together, so it gives you some level of the idea of how complex it is to put these together. Any of these require leadership support. So if you're going to go down the road of a zero-based budget, you really have to have the senior staff and command fully behind it, because again, it's going to task resources, time, and effort. And I would suggest that it's an easier way to implement a zero-based budget is by bringing in a component at a time. So you may end up just doing a zero-based budget for one component of that group to get a better sense of how zero-based budgeting works. So let's say you were going to set up a community engagement team. Well, that first year you do it, use the strategies of a zero-based budget to walk through all of the things we've talked about to help you think about how you're going to identify it, explain it, justify it, and adjust for cost. So public safety. Well, obviously zero-based budgeting can work in public safety because it's perfect for services in public safety that should be reevaluated on an annual basis for their efficiencies. Zero-based budgeting enables precise allocation of resources, again, because it's so fine-tuned. And it also can be really helpful for those of you that are deputy chiefs or chiefs that have to go out into a community and effectively explain and justify to your community why you're spending X amount of dollars on a specific program or process, or for that matter, a specific thing. Examples of zero-based budgeting, several municipalities have effectively applied zero-based budget to enhance public safety initiatives. Targeted funding benefits. Targeted funding through zero-based budgeting allows cities to allocate resources more effectively. And I spoke already of the community impact. Evaluating the effectiveness and outcome. As for example, analyzing response time is critical to understand how quickly public safety can address emergency incidents. Crime rates we use. Monitoring crime rates helps us gauge the effectiveness of public safety strategies, and zero-based budgeting can help in the process of an implementation to reduce crime by targeting those programs to meet the objectives that were laid out in that strategic plan. And of course, community satisfaction surveys are going to be good because you're going to be transparent and you're going to be very open with the community. You're going to get a very brief overview of the zero-based budget process in itself. I just want to take a quick look at the guidance for completing. It's pretty well laid out as to what the expectations are. The big ones that we look at as you go through this is that you have a solid justification, item number 3, and more importantly, that you have research supporting the recommendations that are being made. Sometimes the research could be, like I said, National Institutes of Justice on a particular item. Sometimes it could be statistical data that comes out of these different agencies of why you integrate something. Some of it could be through service journals, some of it could be professional journals. The point is, as I read through the recommendations, I'll be looking for not only the justification, but some of the underlying support that goes with that. And of course, as usual, we'll be looking for proper APA, et cetera. So make sure you take a couple minutes to review the guidance for completing this assignment. It should give you a pretty good fundamental review of what's necessary. And then, as it says at the bottom, think about it from a strategic perspective. I want to make sure that whatever you bring forward aligns back to your mission statement and your strategic plan and your 5-year plan. And don't make the assumption, make it clear in the report that's coming forward how these things relate to the overall objectives you're trying to meet. Hopefully this will help you a little bit. I know this is a fairly complex assignment, and that's why they're basically 2 weeks allowed for the completion. Take care and wish you the best.